Welcome to the ASPG Victoria branch and our second seminar for this year, Professionalising the Role of an MP. Before commencing the seminar proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Parliament House sits and pay my respects to the elders past and present. My name's Andrew Young and I am the Chair of the Victorian Chapter, and I'm pleased to open proceedings. Just before introducing our panel and the facilitator, I will take 1 minute to bring you all up to date with a little bit of branch news. Firstly, and most importantly, membership fees have been called for via an email. It was an ASPG email that went out on the 21st of May from Vaughan, our Honorary Treasurer, who would like your money. So if you could keep a lookout for that, please, or if you know people who would like to join for a first time, Rachel or Vaughan, I'm sure, would be able to assist. We've also done some much needed work on updating the information on the Victorian branch pages of the ASPG website. So the ASPG website is found at aspg.org.au, and the Victorian branch information you can find on the site includes a list of current and past events and also a YouTube link to the recordings of previous seminars. And that can be found via the online media and transcripts page of the website. So now on to our seminar and the panel. Firstly, I'd like to welcome and introduce Rachel Payne. Rachel's in her first term as a member of the Legislative Council for South Eastern Metropolitan region. Rachel is a member of the Legalise Cannabis Party, and prior to entering Parliament, Rachel was the executive of Eros Association and held leadership, project management, policy and research roles with the Family Court of Australia and Centrelink, a diverse background. Rachel holds postgraduate qualifications in public policy and an undergraduate degree in sociology and politics. She also is an acclaimed performer, travelling internationally to perform as Freckles Blue in Paris and London, which I found out a little bit more about before the seminar. As I say, fantastically interesting background. Rachel, welcome tonight. I'd also like to welcome the Honourable Chris Pearce, who's sitting closest to me. And Chris is an Adjunct Professor at Deakin University Business School, and he's the former member for Aston in the House of Representatives, during which time he also served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. Chris has years of experience in business and contributing to boards and advisory committees, including the McKinnon Institute, which of course focuses on professional development of MPs, so much overlap with tonight's topic. Chris is currently undertaking a PhD on a subject matter that continues his commitment to improving the capabilities of MPs. And I've really summarised your background there, Chris, because again, like Rachel's, it's an amazing background. And then sitting furthest away from me is Dr. Peter Ferguson, who's a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Deakin University and is currently politics and international relations discipline convener. Before joining Deakin in 2015, Deakin lectured in political science at the University of Melbourne, where he obtained his PhD in international relations in 2014. Peter was part of the Deakin team who completed the world-first study of former members called Transitioning to Life After Parliament, a study sponsored by the Former Members Association and the Victorian Parliament. Peter was also a member of the team that recently completed the updated standards for codes of conduct for MPs in parliaments in the Commonwealth. Our panel will be facilitated by Dr. Colleen Lewis, who I'll hand over to in a second. Colleen's the Honorary Professor at Australian Studies Institute at the ANU. She's a member of our ASPG Victoria Executive Committee and someone who has developed decades of highly regarded work relating to Parliament and governance integrity, including the role of individual MPs in that space. Colleen, I'm very happy to hand over to you now.
I've always got to do this. Thank you, Andrew. And it's a real pleasure to be chairing this panel session today, because I think it's a very important topic. It's something that we need to delve into a lot more than we normally do. The title is Professionalising the Role of MPs. So we're going to start off at least by focusing on education and training, on expectations that MPs had when they took on the role, and also where they think they could have actually benefited from a lot more support in the education and training space, but we don't want it just confined to that. But I'm going to be asking a couple of set questions to the two, the serving and the former Member of Parliament, and then to get an academic perspective, a research-based perspective. Also, I'll be asking Peter to share his extensive knowledge with us. So, Chris, I'll start with you and go down in that manner, if that's all right. I just think that upon reflection, what compulsory, and I'd stress the word compulsory here, what compulsory education and training programs do you think would have actually allowed you to be better prepared for the complex and very diverse and demanding role of MP? And is there anything you think could have assisted you more than just education and training, especially in those first 12 months where everything is a little bit chaotic and you're trying to get on top of it all? So that's the question I'll also be putting to Rachel. So we'll start with you. Just perhaps 3, 4, 5 minutes.
Well, Colleen, thank you for such an easy question to start with. So simple and straightforward. What would have prepared me? Goodness me, the mind boggles. So a couple of points. In my view, things firstly have got a lot better than when I first went in. I was in a situation where I won a by-election, and if you want to go into Parliament, on the one side of the sword, winning a by-election is good because people know that you've won the by-election. On the other side, you come in and you're in between, the start and the end of the Parliament, if you like. So, there's no induction program, there's nothing, you're literally thrown into the deep end. So in my particular case, there was very, very little. One of the things that Andrew mentioned is I'm very proud to be on the board of the McKinnon Institute. We're now part of the offering for inducting new MPs, particularly at the Commonwealth level. So it's much better now than what it was. The second point I'd like to make is that, in my view, there isn't, and there can never be almost, a comprehensive end-to-end program that will ever fully prepare you for this job. Now, that might sound strange because other people will say, well, of course you can be trained for a job. Doctors are trained and accountants are trained and what have you. But it's interesting, in my own research that I'm doing now, I'm interviewing former and current members of the Australian House of Representatives. As you know, a lot of those former and currents have been in and around politics for a long time before they become MPs. As a matter of fact, it's something that'll probably come up. It's an increasing trend, isn't it, that people are former advisors or they're former this or what have you. It's interesting, without exception, nearly all of them have said to me, I never realised how different it was once I became the member. So I don't believe that there's such a thing as a comprehensive program that can prepare you fully, because it is just such a unique role. And what makes it unique, of course, is how you yourself perceive what your role is. Every person comes to it with a different perception. And Colin, you know of some of the great work that's been done over in Canada with the Samara. Grant Jones, an academic in Australia, did some research in, I think, 07, 08, where he looked at the styles of parliamentarians. He identified 5 sorts of parliamentarians. One sort come in and they think themselves as the parliamentarian. They're the legislature, so they're sort of grandiose. It's all about the chamber. It's all about the passing of the bill. So how they behave is completely different to the next sort, which is a servant of the constituents. Their focus is about looking after the electorate back home. So how they perform in their role is completely different. Third one was the partisan. It's all about the ideological view, about winning the war, and how they behave is completely different. And then there was the theorist, so how they behave is based on the theory and if you like, and then there's the policy specialist, somebody who gets elected on a particular platform and how they behave. So it's very difficult to get a comprehensive program. Having said that, if I had my time over again, history. I wish I had have read so much more about the past. You know, I've since I've left politics, I've read more about politics than what I've read when I was in, and I think I would have been a much better politician if I had have understood about some of the stuff that happened in the past. I think prioritisation. I'd come from a business background, so I had some ideas. I'd been to Stanford and I'd done other programs, a business degree, an MBA and all the rest of it. But I think things like prioritisation, scheduling, all of that, you need to know better. I think understanding political theory, part of that history and reading, I would have been a better politician. I think critical issue here, understanding stakeholder engagement. You know, a lot of people come into a political role thinking it's all about them. That will surprise you for a politician. But, you know, politicians cannot do anything by themselves. It's a fact. You need to have this whole chain of key stakeholders. So understanding how to manage stakeholders, how to develop relationships. If you said to a politician, is relationships important? They'll all say, of course they are. But understanding how to manage those to get the outcome you want is absolutely critical. They're the types of areas. Parliamentary procedure, I felt like I was just thrown in the deep end. It took me a long time to feel comfortable in the chamber. A bit of good advice I got was just go and sit in the chamber and try and feel it, if you like. That did work, but it took a while.
We might have to pass on and come back to some of those, especially the one of feeling in the chamber, because I wouldn't like a surgeon to go into an operating theatre and just hang around for a while so he could feel it. But I take your point. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. And I concur. I think when I first started in Parliament, the advice that I was given was just the practical advice. Go in and sit in the chamber, understand how things work. And I've been in Parliament now nearly 18 months, and I've realised only this week that I'm starting to actually understand how all these moving parts work and how all the nuts and bolts of things do connect together. But I think for me, if I was to be given advice for when I first started, it would be first and foremost about time management, because there is so many competing priorities in this role, and nothing can prepare you for the fact that you have a sitting week and then the following week you're in your electorate office, you have stakeholder engagement, you have constituent engagement, projects that you're working on within your purview, and as someone elected under a single party issue as Legalise Cannabis, you're focusing on campaigns and representing that part of your community as well. But understanding that you do represent, in my case, I represent the southeastern Metropolitan, which is 600,000 constituents. So I actually spend a little bit of time looking at my fellow colleagues and who they represent in our community and where there was gaps, and who I felt I could best represent. And I felt like there wasn't any voice for LGBTIQ people in my region. Now, as someone who does identify as LGBTIQ, I felt that I had to then, that was something that was dear to me and something that I could represent with goodwill. When it came to women and family violence issues, that's something that is also very dear to me and something that I felt I could represent. So for me, it was more about the practicalities. I think conflict resolution would be also something that would be really important to learn. No matter how prepared you are in this situation, it is very emotional, and it is just politics. However, it is very emotional, and I wasn't prepared for that. And people management, I think that you are dealing with so many different diverse people and people from all different backgrounds that some people management training would have been really valuable. And just finally, I'd also highlight the ability to have work-life balance, because I don't have a day off now, and I'm sure most MPs do say the same. Even on your day off, you tend to look at your emails, You tend to plan for what you are going to be doing the following day or the following week, even just preparing for heading into Parliament for the week. And this week I forgot to pack socks. So all of these things of having a list prepared is something that is constantly ticking through your mind. And I think it's really important to have that education around making sure you're maintaining your work-life balance, because you don't want to burn out.
Very interesting. Yeah, Peter, can you give us your perspective from all your extensive research and actually tell us what you believe perhaps might help politicians to undertake what, from our serving and former politician, we've just heard is a very demanding job. Yeah. Thanks,
Colleen. Why don't I'll tell you one thing I think will help and one thing that won't help, and that might be interesting. Look, as Andrew alluded to earlier on, we did a fairly big piece of research a few years ago where we spoke to about 40 former members of this place and also interviewed surveyed almost 100 of them. And it was about the challenges they faced in transitioning from Parliament, and for quite a number actually, they were quite profound. Be they psychological, emotional challenges, financial challenges, professional challenges, and the like. And certainly, you know, the image of the politician getting the soft landing in the cushy job and all of that kind of thing is certainly not borne out by the evidence. One of the things that would help from day one, I think, for many MPs is to actually invert Max Weber's famous saying that politics is a vocation to politics has to be thought of as a transitory vocation, because it might not be very long. It might be 4 years. On average, it will be 8 years. And any longer, you have to be in a pretty safe seat or be basically lucky. And that's whether that's at the state level or the federal level as well. Of course, what sitting MPs, especially from day one, don't think about is their departure. And they perhaps don't put thought into the fact that the career is going to be, in all likelihood, so transitory. So one of the things we recommended in that report, and the recommendation was built on interviews with the Australian Football League and the Cricket Australia and other elite sporting organisations, where basically when an 18-year-old goes into that environment, they're basically told, well, you've got to develop a non-athletic identity because, you know, you might break your leg next week or you might not be good enough, and this might be all over very, very quickly. Now, you know, hopefully in politics you're not breaking legs or all that kind of thing, but I think to have MPs have a view from the start that actually this is transitory and thinking about what comes next could be very, very helpful in terms of having a softer landing at the end of their career. But of course, very hard to even think about that if you're fighting to save a marginal seat or whatever. You know, you can be focused on that. So there's a big challenge there. So, you know, career development that begins from that premise would be important. That's what I think, you know, something that could be added. I think what isn't a very good education from our research is actually being so focused on entering Parliament that perhaps life experience doesn't come beforehand. And as someone who teaches politics at a university, and I will see a room of 18 and 19-year-olds every year, some of whom will quite openly say their ambition is to you know, get onto this party position, get a job in a MP's office, and eventually be elected an MP in their 30s. And I think, well, you know, I'm not sure I want you representing me. You know, go and do something else. And what we've seen in our research has brought this out, that in the 1950s, this is at the federal parliament, about 17% of MPs had either been party officials or union officials or worked in some sort of, it was basically secretarial roles then, supporting MPs. That figure had become to 45% by the early 2000s. It's back down to 23% in the current parliament. So I think that tells you, and we've got colleagues at the ANU who talk about the career de-separation problem in Westminster democracies, not just in Australia, but in all Westminster democracies, where that career path is now such that the incentive structures at all points are a little bit warped. The incentive structure for people who are going through that advisor, electoral officer position, if they want to become MPs, and I acknowledge not all do, some are doing it for other reasons, is often not to give frank and fearless advice. It's actually to position for that next, to get pre-selection and all of those kind of things. And that's problematic. So I think that on the one hand, yes, you're learning the job, and as Chris said, that's fine, but there's a big difference between being the advisor and being the MP. But also, is that actually the best education, the best preparation? And our research suggests that maybe that's not the case. So I guess that's the two things. One thing we'd like to see, and one thing we'd like to see a bit less of.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wonder, for other professions, one of the prerequisites to be categorised in a profession is a job description. The other thing is there is independence in decision-making in most professions. That is not available to members of parliament if they belong to a political party. So I just wondered if people would like to comment on whether a job description, as loose as it may have to be, because I found it difficult to think that only members of parliament can't have a job description. So it could be a loose one, but it might be alerting to people to that. So I'd like to get people's opinions on things like that. And then the idea of, if members of parliament wish to be considered professionals, about the autonomy in the decision-making sphere, especially if you belong, as I said, to a political party. So we might start with you, Rachel, and go on to Chris, and then see what Peter has to say.
I think one of the first things that I was talked to about this role is that there is no KPIs, and I'm used to managing myself, but in that respect, it was very much your KPIs are getting re-elected, and I often think, how do we categorise ourselves and what sort of position we are in here? And I often break it down when I try and communicate what I do to people in the way of, I consider politicians to either be an advocate, an activist, or an anarchist, really, in this place. And for me, I'm all about collaboration. For me, that's key, and I see myself as an advocate. That's how I have moved through this world in any job that I've had, and how I build a team around me. I also think it's really important to surround yourself with people who are different from you, and I have actively made sure that my team of people that I work with are people from different backgrounds, different parts of community, different ages as well. So I think it's also part of who you surround yourself with.
Okay, and what about independence in decision-making? Although, do you have that as an issue, belonging to a smaller party?
The interesting thing about my pathway to politics was, I was actually behind the scenes helping getting the party registered, and Legalise Cannabis has a very unique story by way of, we were only a registered political party 1 month out of the election. So when we got elected, and there was 2 of us who got elected into the upper house, and roughly I think the vote was just above 4% across the board in the state, was that we had a very simple policy position of legalising cannabis. We also had 6 policy points that were around saving the environment, relaxing the hemp laws, access to driving and cheaper medicine for patients, allowing home grow. So when we came to this place, we didn't really have a position on anything else but the way I relate that back to anything we work on in this space is that fundamentally what I'm dealing with are human rights issues, and it's about compassion and it's about evidence. So we use that filter on anything that we might approach. And I think that that's a really unique position to be in as a crossbencher, because we are often that deciding vote. So we have to be across every piece of legislation that comes before us. And when you're speaking on something that you may not have experience in, you really do need to get up to speed of what you're speaking on. In comparison, if I was with a major party, I would be handed a speech that says this is how you're speaking on and this is how you're voting. So I think it's actually reflective of where your position is in Parliament and how much you're willing to put into that as well.
It's an interesting perspective. Thank you. Chris.
Thanks, Rachel. So the issue about MPs not having a job description, has been a topic that's been around for decades. Different jurisdictions have had a go at it. In the UK, there was a committee a number of years ago that drafted a bipartisan job description. Didn't get very far. They've now outlined what they call the core responsibilities of the role, if you like. There's been some work done here in Australia in and around it, more along the sort of lines of not a job description, but what good looks like, if you like. It's very difficult. And of course, it starts really from the fact that the Constitution doesn't actually stipulate anything. And so that's the core of the problem. That, you know, one of the things I had to come to terms with when I got elected to the federal parliament, I had no actual responsibilities in the Constitution except for one. That's to show up when Parliament's called. By the way, it means show up, doesn't mean you've got to stay. But that's the only real requirement that's stipulated. Outside of that, you know, technically speaking, you can do whatever you like. I suggested you pay for it at the ballot box in one way or another. So it's a very, very difficult issue, and the problem with it is, it comes back to my earlier point, it's because everybody sees their role differently, and you can't get two MPs to agree on what the role is, if you like. So I doubt that there'll ever be a formalised, constitutionalised, recognised role description. There might end up being more detailed responsibilities or core responsibilities. Represent your constituents, attend Parliament, keep the government accountable, if you like. When it comes to the issue of KPIs, what I found in my own experience, I mean, at the end of the day, Rachel's point is right. Your number one KPI is to get re-elected, if that's what you want. But in my experience, and certainly what I did, and my colleagues that I was close to at the time, and again in the people that I'm talking to in my research, most MPs set their own KPIs. I've met very few MPs who actually don't formally have some KPIs that they have set for themselves. Most of them do it by year, because you will appreciate the political cycle in year one is different to the political cycle in year 3 or year 4, depending on your jurisdiction. So if you ask an MP, how will you measure your success? Most of them will tell you based on their KPIs, and they're in and around things like margin, winning, margin growth, number of constituents, interfaces, for whatever better word, whether it's one-on-one, et cetera, et cetera. So that in the background, they are actively wanting to measure themselves. The point about being a member of a major party like I was and how that impacts on your professionalism, I reject the suggestion that just because you're in a major party and you follow the party line, that doesn't make you professional. I mean, at the end of the day, you can go against your party. Now, depending on when, where, who and what, that will either be a career advancement or a career limiting move. And we've seen all of that. But I think part of being a member of parliament is trying to find a way where you can influence the outcomes. Now, when I was younger, I was born and bred in the country of New South Wales. I probably should have been a national when I was younger. As I've got older, I've changed in, as I think a lot of people do in a lot of ways. I was a member of the Liberal Party, and very proud member of the Liberal Party, but I did not agree with everything that my party did. But I tell you what, where I didn't, I did my best to try and change it and alter it to get to a position which I found acceptable, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it actually, in a strange way, Colleen, requires you to be even more professional when you're in that situation.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to the question at a referendum that asks about a job description for parliamentarians. I think that would be an interesting one. Peter, over to you, please.
Yeah, look, I'd probably push back on the notion that MPs don't have decision-making scope, and B, that would be a signal of lack of professionalism. I mean, we forget in Australia where we have a fairly high level of party discipline by Westminster system standards compared to the UK, where MPs will routinely vote en masse against their party leadership, let alone non-Westminster systems, such as the United States. But I think, as Chris said, and I'm at danger of iterating your point, Chris, is that just because you may have to vote a certain way in the chamber doesn't mean you've haven't exercised judgment or your position in other forums within the party room or caucus or wherever. So, but then to is the custom to talk over the bells, or you let them ring? I don't know.
If you can scream.
But then, I mean, many professions where, sure, some of the textbook definitions of professionalism is the exercising of fairly, high levels of judgment and discretion on an individual basis. But there are many instances in professions when that's not the case, and you are effectively following a party line anyway. So I guess that maybe is not the right way to characterise professionalism or less professionalism. In terms of KPIs, I mean, as an academic, we're pretty resistant to the notion of KPIs as well. I'm sure there are some out there, but they were probably drawn up by HR and no one ever looks at them. And that, for some people, is fine, but for other people it's disconcerting. And I'm wondering, and this might be more of a question to those who have spent more time in parliaments, either as members or as staff or whatever, that sometimes that lack of structured KPI might be disconcerting for some individuals, but for other people it might not be at all, and actually it opens up opportunities to make of the role what they will and develop into that role. So that's perhaps a provocation. And the final point I'd make is that the path in terms of time between being elected and becoming a minister, or let alone a prime minister or premier, has compressed both federally and at state levels from decades to years, and sometimes mere months, and sometimes no time at all. And I think the length of apprenticeship, the backbench apprenticeship now, had a role in training and preparing and allowing MPs to find what their role would be and define it for themselves. And with that going now, I mean, you can be in a minister and out within a decade. In the old days that wasn't the case. So that kind of informal on-the-job training, I think, is something that is lacking, and perhaps it's occurring in that more problematic space as an advisor or an electoral officer.
Thank you. In most professions, in all professions and in many occupations, it is compulsory to undertake education and training programs. And it's also compulsory in quite a lot of them that you have to have ongoing compulsory education and training if you wish to stay accredited. Now, I understand members of Parliament aren't accredited as such, but I just wondered what everybody thought about compulsory education and training for parliamentarians, because the research shows very clearly that when it is voluntary, you can get to a situation sometimes when there are more presenters, experts there than there are members of Parliament sitting in the room. And this was very much the case in the United Kingdom when they really tried to revolutionise education and training. And quite frankly, they gave up after a while because they would sit in rooms and nobody would turn up. They thought if they didn't have a structured time for education and training and just made it very flexible, it might suit the demands on members of Parliament. Sometimes they sat there for hours and nobody turned up at all. So they gave all that up. So I just wondered if you think, given that the role of Member of Parliament means that they can affect the lives of every single person in whatever jurisdiction they happen to be serving in. So, and we do that with so little. Now, sure, we don't want to get to the stage where you have to have an educational standard to become a Member of Parliament. I understand that. But once elected, the idea that there has to be something put into the parliamentary calendar that is compulsory for you to attend. I just wondered what you three of you thought of that. Perhaps we'll start with you, Chris, and then Rachel, and then Peter.
Thanks, Colleen. So I support very strongly education and training. And I think in areas like workplace culture, the law, different things like that, I think it's incredibly important. Like any other role, members of Parliament have to understand workplace laws. They have, I remember reading Cathy McGowan's book. She made the point that when she first got elected, she set up her office, and she said it was like running a small business, in a way. So you have to understand about these things. And I think we've seen instances, haven't we, of where, workplace and different cultures have been exhibited, which I think could have been eradicated through better training and education and whatever. And so do I support education and training? Absolutely. Particularly in areas where, we all need updating, et cetera, et cetera. I've been a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors for, over 20 years, but I still go to AICD courses about the law and all the rest. You've got to keep yourself up to date. So I just think it's logical, if you like. Colleen, the problem arises about this issue about the compulsory nature or the non-compulsory nature, and I want to make a couple of points if I can. The first thing is the temperament of MPs. In my experience, there are people that are just like sponges. They just want it. Please give it to me. And they'll take it and they'll show up and they'll do everything they can. But there's another group of people that are in public office, and I don't know whether you've ever noticed this, Colleen, but when someone gets elected, they become an expert on most things almost overnight. And so, there's this sort of thing about, well, I actually don't need to be trained. So there's a culture issue to overcome there to start with. The other problem is, when is the training going to happen? Now, of course, if you prioritise anything, you'll do it. We all know that, so I'm not being that naive. But, if you're going to, if I was in Parliament and I was being told that I've got to go to this certain training thing, when are you going to do it? Are you going to do it on the weekend? So I've been in Canberra all week. I've got back home and now you want me to go on a Sunday afternoon because that's the only time. You're going to do it during the parliamentary week. I've got committee work and the House is sitting until 10:30 every night. So when are you going to do it? So, and by the way, it's all right for you, Bill, because your seat margin is 33% and I'm on 1%. And so you're going to pull me out of my electorate for 2 days of compulsory education. You're in a safe seat. Of course you're happy to go, etc. So you've got all these factors that impinge. So I would prefer there to be a culture that develops amongst parliamentarians at all levels across the country that recognise and value education and training, and it's the done thing that you do it, not because you have to do it, would be my preference. And you prioritise it just like any other aspect of your role. But I think if you start to say to people, you must go to that training session, it is on Saturday morning, it's in, I'll exaggerate my point, it's in Adelaide. You haven't been in your electorate for 4 weeks, but who cares? That's when it's scheduled. I'm not sure that it'd survive very long.
That's interesting. Be interesting too if perhaps the legal profession or the medical profession or the teaching profession adopted that attitude. And I make that point only because I think it's starting to highlight from the answers that there is a particular complex job, but I don't know if these things are unfathomable. But anyhow, Rachel, I'm interested in your opinion.
I agree. I think the culture around valuing education and constantly educating ourselves sometimes is lacking in when it comes to ego as well. And this, unfortunately, in this place, ego does tend to be rife. But in saying that, I think, and I've just had a recent experience where I've been approached by the Tables office, who are absolute wizards in this place and understand how we are to present things in Parliament. They are your go-to when it comes to anything you're wanting to table in Parliament or any bills that you're wanting to put forward. And they took myself and my team through some training, and it actually gave me further insight because you're so overwhelmed in your first instance in Parliament and your first year. But after sitting down with them, I realised that there's so many more options for me to use Parliament process to my advantage. And things like petitions, things like speaking on tabled reports was something that I didn't really have capacity to do in my first year because I was getting an understanding of what parliamentary process was. But these are things that as you learn and develop in the role, you start to see that there's more opportunity to use your parliamentary privilege in that space, I would say. I would also say that engagement with stakeholders has been the best thing for learning going forward, because they are your experts. So they are the people that you contact when you need further information about how this will how a piece of legislation will impact real world, either community organisations or real world organisations more broadly within your community, different sectors. And I find that they are really willing and able to offer that advice and support as well.
Thank you. Peter.
Thanks. I think all of those views on training and education were sort of represented in our interviews of former MPs too, and they look back at their career that actually more formal training requirements would have been problematic for all the reasons that Chris outlined, but also that the informal training opportunities were the ones that were most useful, whether they were within the parties but more often actually provided by the institution. In terms of accreditation, I think that's highly problematic when the idea that you need a qualification, and in fact I think we need a variety of different qualifications, and so that's important. I guess I'd add that if we're talking about accreditation, the more important form of accreditation might be to somehow offer, open up space within the parliamentary career to maintain one's accreditation in their previous profession. Because at some point, the member might have to go back to that. And that's very, very difficult when you're working, I don't know how many hours, but a lot of hours, as we've heard. And, if part of that accreditation required a continuity of practice, for example, if the journalist caught you down at running a clinic if you're a doctor or doing legal work, they'd be all over you moonlighting doing something else. But you might actually have to do that to maintain your accreditation. From talking to people in the UK, where they've moved pretty quickly post the expenses scandal in 2009, from a large number of MPs having second jobs, and often that being their previous occupation, but done in a slightly less full-time way, to virtually all MPs, irrespective of whether they're a backbench MP and might not even have room to actually physically attend the chamber, not being able to work outside Parliament, has caused a kind of professionalisation which is highly problematic. And my colleagues and I gave evidence to a House of Commons Select Committee, must have been early last year, I think it was, into supports for outgoing members, which was obviously were called because we'd done this work here. And at that point, it was pretty clear there'd be a landslide election where 200 plus, mainly Conservative MPs were going to lose their seats. The basic demographics there were people in their early 40s to late 40s who had mortgages, school fees, all these expenses, probably elderly parents they were caring, all the complicated things that happen. And they were about to be tossed out of their jobs, and they had probably been staff members for MPs for years before that, so they hadn't sort of had another professional identity or profession to go back to. And they were thinking, well, we need to support these people, which is of course is very politically hard. What they were saying though is prior to 2009, many of those people would have been doing a bit of consulting on the side, or they would have been keeping up with something else, and that would have been completely uncontroversial. It was implied they probably made better MPs too. And the story I was relating to Colleen was just, we gave this evidence. It was, I think Lynn Truss had resigned and they were about to ballot for the next leader. And the chair of the committee, who was a Tory, and I've forgotten his name, I'm afraid, but he basically said, I'm worried we'll go back to Boris because these people think that he might have more of a chance of saving their seat than someone else. And he was basically saying, look, it creates the wrong kind of incentive and the wrong kind of decision-making because of the fear of losing the seat and fear of the consequences. So it's one thing to fear losing your seat. If the consequences are serious, that's also a problem. So.
Thank you. We're going to have to sort of bring it to a close so we can go to questions from the audience. But just one thing, I did some research with South African members of Parliament some 10, 12 years ago. And it was very interesting there because with the transition out of the apartheid era, a lot of people who stood for Parliament didn't have really very much education at all, that they were making very good MPs to represent their constituencies. But what the Parliament did was say, if you want to get a degree, by the time you leave this Parliament, we will assist you in doing that. And the other thing they did is, you know, who actually understands the budget papers? Yeah, I did an undergrad in economics and politics, and I'm sorry. So they spent 3 weeks spending time with those parliamentarians to make sure that they understood, at a simple level like we all probably have of the budget papers, but so they could actually know how to decide whether this was really a good thing or whether there are issues they should raise. So I always figured that if South Africa can do that, other democracies could well be doing other things in areas where it's most important, that people who are voting on something really important that affects every single person's lives actually understood how to read what it is they're voting on. But on that note, I think it's time I hand it over to the audience, and people could just ask one question, not a double-barreled one, just one. I know I say this, but it's important because lots of people want an opportunity to ask questions. And I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a lead-up to the question, but not too long a statement. Just get to the question so everybody can have a go. So who would like to ask a question? And please be the first one to put your hand up. Good. We'll start with, yes? Up the back, please, and then Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I was really interested in diverse views and different sides of politics and academia as well. I was interested earlier on talking about the informal learning that can happen. Is there much of that? I think you mentioned a members group or something, which I think, I work in the community system. I know when we did regional hearings, members when they did it up before, and I like the conversations, they talk about the challenges they find. Different parties can find things in common and they learn from each other like that. Is there a lot of that goes on? Because that seems as important as informal training.
Brief answers from everybody.
Yes, and I think what I've found most interesting is you do find friendships across the board of different political persuasions, and you do come together to support one another because it is such a unique space. We also had, when we first arrived, we jokingly call it MP School, which was 2 days of intensive workshopping where it was everything from these are some of the rules in chamber through to take your shoes off and we're going to work with a NIDA drama performance and this is how you pretend to be a lion. And that made us all connect because we all had to do this silly process. And one of my colleagues here is giggling with me because we occasionally all go to one another when we think about it. But those sorts of breaking down those connections and forming those working relationships has been important to provide that support to one another, definitely.
Yes, I agree entirely. That's why it came up earlier. That's why an apprenticeship is so important when you come in. Because if you come in and you go straight into the executive too soon, of course you get knocked out of all the committee process. John Howard was a very firm believer in doing an apprenticeship on the backbench for all sorts of reasons, but mostly because that's the way that you learn, that's the way you develop relationships. The committee process was, for me, was outstanding. Was probably one of the best aspects of the job. Partly because you got to talk to real people when you went and did an inquiry. I travelled, across the country in the inquiries I was involved in. I was on education and training. We did an inquiry into the education of young kids. It was just life-changing for me. I was on family and community services as well. If you had have said to me when I went into Parliament that I would end up being really good friends with some of the people that were opposite me, I would have said, well, whatever you're having, I'm not having. But I did. And it was because in airport lounges, in hotel receptions, in committee breaks, you get to know them. And the fact is that, in my experience, you share more in common than you are different on, if you like. So the committee process is absolutely invaluable in my opinion, and that's why doing an apprenticeship is so important. when I went from the back bench to the middle bench and become a pale sec, I got thrown off the committees. You can't be on them, if you like. There's lots of others informal groups too. In the federal parliament, one of the very common things is the class group. So I won the by-election in the middle of 2001. There was a general election at the end of 2001, but I was voted chair of the class of 2001, and so that becomes a group. You become that cohort, if you like. We had dinners, we had lunches, we had guest speakers, built a great deal of camaraderie against that sort of group that you came in with, if you like. And there's a lot of other things around areas of policy interests, if you like, and different beliefs. I'm a Christian, so I was secretary of the Parliamentary Christian Fellowship for many years. Another group where, it was bipartisan. I got to see aspects of political adversaries that I would never have been able to see.
Peter, your comments, please.
Well, I might actually pick up on having never been an MP and have no intention ever to be one. Actually, this is an interesting thing. I mean, the more you learn about it, you realise how difficult it is, and it actually, I think, increases one's respect for what MPs do, whether you agree with them politically or not. It makes one less inclined to think it's... but anyway, that's by the way. Look, something that you said, Colleen, with respect to South Africa and the obtaining of university degrees, and I guess perhaps as someone who's been in a university of one kind of their whole adult life, I can say this with hopefully some authority, but I think we've actually gone too far in this country and indeed in Western society of holding up university qualifications as somehow a gold standard for a whole range of things. Obviously, some areas, yes, but not other areas. And it wasn't that long ago that we had a Prime Minister who left school at 15, and no one will deny that he didn't know how to use the Parliament, whether you agree with his politics or not. And you go back a few other generations, and there were MPs from all sides who had never set foot in universities, yet were very, very effective members. And I just wonder that the focusing on qualifications, be they, either tertiary qualifications or kind of professional qualifications that might mimic part of that, constrains the pool of people who we deem to be appropriate as MPs. So certainly those who are coming from backgrounds that we don't consider professional. I think that is probably partly problematic, but also Chris used the word apprenticeship, and maybe that's a better way of thinking about it than as professionalisation or education or whatever. So,
Good, thank you. Andrew, you had your hand up. No, not at the moment.
Perhaps this question Chris might want to comment on from a personal point of view, and Peter perhaps might pick up on anything that came out of the transitioning report. But just looking at it the other way, coming out of your political career, are there particular things that stand out to you as to professional qualities and skills that you obtained, which then benefited you at coming out the other end?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, absolutely. I had a corporate business career before I went into politics, and then I was in local government in the 1990s. It's the worst form of politics, but anyway, that's another issue. And then I had 10 years in the federal parliament. I mentioned earlier, I think at the start, my opening remarks, stakeholder engagement and what have you. Governing is hard. Governing is hard work. And the fact that you can do anything is, nothing short of a miracle sometimes, because it doesn't matter what policy area or what you're seeking to do, there are so many disparate stakeholders involved in this process. And to get something to start from here and end up actually here, it just involves so much. So in corporate life, I had to manage relationships, but politics taught me relationship building and stakeholder management like no other time in my career. Point one. The second point is listening. I would have said before politics that yes, I listened, but when you're in corporate life and you're the boss, that's my decision. onwards and upwards. And, you know, generally in corporate life, your team get behind you and what have you. If you take that approach in politics, quite often everybody goes the other way. So you cannot have this, it's my way or it's the highway. So relationships, compromise and listening, you know, I think my experience took me to another level of understanding and appreciation of that that I hadn't seen before in my career. And I think coming out of politics and going straight back to business, I think I was a better person because of that. I think I was much more empathetic and much more open to other people's views, strangely as it might seem. But, you know, to get anything to happen in politics, you need people. You need people to help you. You cannot do these things by yourself. So there are a couple of things that I think I learned very much.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, I think the level of ignorance about what MPs actually do is quite startling in the community. But as part of our project, we interviewed some corporate headhunters, and they were incredibly ignorant. They basically thought, oh, well, what do we do with former MPs or even former ministers? They were fairly lost on. They seemed to share the view that beyond, you know, the theatrics of House of Representatives, House of Reps question time, you know, there wasn't much else to it, which was quite astounding. So I think there's no appreciation of the skills, there's no appreciation of the committee work, there's no appreciation of all of the, for better word, soft skills that Chris is talking about, and all of those kind of things, sort of, you know, even in the corporate sector. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of other sort of misconceptions. One is that a former MP, well, you'd never want to employ them because all they want to do is get back into Parliament, which I thought was for a corporate headhunter to say that, I thought was displayed a fairly high degree of ignorance. And a few other things as well that really gave you a sense that actually the level of understanding of the skills is really not there. And unfortunately, I think the media play a really big part in that. And you know, the debates around MP pay, for example, are always really, I think, unconstructive. And I always say to people, look, you know, divide the pay by the hours they do and you've got a pretty miserable rate. But of course, that doesn't fly because, you know, backbench salaries are still significantly more than the median wage, even though the hourly rate mightn't be as good as well. So I think there's a whole... I'll try and keep talking over it. Always rings when I'm talking. I think, and I don't know what you do about this, but there are so many misconceptions and myths about MPs, which I think, you know, present the job as being cushy, present it as being easy, as being privileged. And there is a degree of privilege there, but there's a huge amount of responsibility as well. And a more mature debate about these issues in the context of salaries and working conditions and superannuation and all of those kind of things would be well and truly overdue.
Yeah. Look, I think we are out of time. Andrew, would you like to offer the thanks?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll get out of your way.
And unfortunately, we're going to hear those bells for a bit longer, I think. So I'll do my best to be heard. And apologies to those who are watching this on a recording later on. Maybe the IT crew can do some magic and make the bells disappear on the recording. Firstly, Colleen, thank you very much for facilitating the session. And to Chris, Rachel and Peter, thank you so much for giving up your time, but also sharing your experience. Rachel and Chris, obviously, in terms of your experience as members and life after Chris, and Peter for your academic pursuits. We are a modest group at the ASPG, but again, I thank the library. We have fantastic connections through the library. We have a magnificent publication on the building, which we'd like to give you all as a token of thanks. And if I could just ask everyone to thank the panel again.